Members, this is the appointed time and we have a quorum. I call this meeting to order. We have a 4-hour meeting, and if necessary, I will at most extend the meeting by 15 minutes. Yesterday we passed one item and we will deal with the remaining 10. I remind members that if there is direct or indirect pecuniary interest in relation to items for discussion today, please disclose the nature of your interest before you speak in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure. Will members please note the voting requirement where direct pecuniary interest is involved under Rule 84 of the ROP. We'll continue discussion on FCR 2018-1935. Mr. Shuka-chun, 5 minutes. Good morning, Chairman. About the Hostel Development Fund, yesterday colleagues asked questions on the one-off grant, whether this will set a precedent so that the electrical monitoring will be circumvented, so that we cannot monitor the use of the fund. I understand that we'll continue to ask these questions. And the Secretary mentioned that hostel life is so important to university students, and that it is very crucial to the learning. And over the years, you have accumulated such a shortfall of hostel places. Then my question is why you need to address the issue in 10 years. Of course, it shows your determination, but if that is the case, if you believe hostel life is so important, why 75% cap? Why not 100%? Why are you asking universities to raise 25% of the funds? Because in other areas, subsidies coming from the UGC for local undergraduates, for example, will not be subject to any discount. So that's a question for Undersecretary. And I also want to add that I need to declare interest. I'm also a teaching staff at a UGC-funded university. Secretary. Well, the government will pay for 75% of the cost of construction of university hostels. There is a history. In the past, provision of hostels places did not relate directly to teaching. For research or teaching-related facilities of universities, the government has always provided full funding. But in the past, regarding hostel places, the view was that it was not directly related to teaching and learning. But in the light of social development, as well as students' development in universities, we do believe that hostels gets more and more important. So when we calculate the shortfall of hostel places, we give this undertaking as a matter of a policy that all undergraduate students should be given the opportunity to stay in a hostel during their stay in the university. And we have been discussing the ratio, 75%. There is no special reason why we cannot pay for the remaining 25% as well. But that's the practice we have been adopting with universities, and the universities don't seem to encounter any problem raising funds. We have not, therefore, considered changing this practice on this occasion. And it is also a guarantee, as far as our funding is concerned, by imposing a 75% cap, because universities will make sure that the funds are properly spent. Because in the past, members would question whether it was necessary to build some of the extravagant facilities. And they will not try to exhaust any funding available from the government because they need to raise 25% of the funds themselves. So we see the merit in imposing a 75% cap. As this is the established practice, we have not considered making any change. So in other words, Chairman, what Secretary suggests is that it is an established practice and we should just go along with it. But this is not a good reason, because for teaching facilities, the government provides a 100% funding, whereas for hostels, as a matter of practice, the government provides 75% funding only. I think you need to come up with a better justification, apart from the fact that it is established practice. Although universities have no problem raising funds, both you and I know that these universities have different capabilities in raising funds. Mr. Wuchiwai. I see from the footnote that for the remaining 2 universities, there is another policy available. So does it mean that for these 2 other universities, the number of hostel places can already meet the need? And with the Education University of Hong Kong properly established, the number of students intake will increase, and there may be a greater demand for hostel places. So what is the mechanism available for Education University of Hong Kong to apply for funding? Because this exercise doesn't apply to these 2 universities. I want to know what mechanism is available. Second, if I understand correctly, the calculation is based on the existing number of university places, so that you can draw up the number of hostel places needed. But there is an uncertainty. The variable is whether the university places will increase in number in the future. Because if the number of university places increases, you need to increase or adjust student hostel places. So will there be additional funding, or will there be another mechanism available? Or will another exercise be conducted so that in the future another one-off grant will be injected or provided to the HDF? Is that the mechanism, so that in the long term there will be proper funding arrangement for the provision of hostels? About land for hostels, I want to know whether this is coordinated by universities themselves or by the government. Secretary. Well, if members refer to enclosure 2 of the paper, you will see that there are all the 15 projects listed and the sites are available. For example, if change of land use is needed, or for example, the consultation procedures would need to go through as we do in any development project. Coming back to Mr. Wuchiwai's question about Lingnan University and the Education University of Hong Kong, under the existing policy, the Hong Kong government has provided all the necessary hostel places. At the moment, there is no shortfall regarding these 2 universities. So this funding application only relates to the 6 universities, not all 8 of them. But Mr. Wu is right in pointing this out. We may need more hostel places if there is this policy for all local undergraduate students to be given an opportunity to stay in a hostel throughout their campus life, and we therefore need to consider how we can make sure this will happen. But at this moment, we don't plan to change the 15,000 university places, because for the number of secondary school students, the projection is that it will decline in the next few years. And for universities, they also need to prepare a 3-year annual budget. There may be some changes in terms of the number of places. And after making up for the shortfall, the universities will be able to cope with any changes by adjusting the number of places, as we do not envisage a major change in the number of university places or a major change in university policies, for example, allowing students to stay at least 2 years in hostels throughout the 4-year program. We won't make a change, but of course if there is the change in policy, we will come back and brief the Legislative Council. We'd like to go for the short-term solution, and that is our approach. And if there is any policy change in the future, we will decide whether to adjust our policy. So in other words, the HTF is for this exercise, is that right? We're going to address the shortfall for 13,400 university places through this HTF exercise. Mr. Ip Kin Yuen. Yesterday, I wasn't here when this item was discussed. I hope that if I ask any repetitive question, you would bear with me. Regarding university places, well, first of all, I'd like to say that I would support the application. But I feel uneased about certain areas, namely a new funding approach. A one-off grant will be provided for all the hostel places of all the 6 universities. If it is lumped together, we won't be able to thoroughly discuss the matter in the panel or at the Finance Committee, whereas in the past we were able to do so. Well, there was a unique circumstance. In the past 5 years, no funding application was approved for all the projects proposed. Because there wasn't any progress in the past 5 years, now we will address the shortfall in one go. And according to the Secretary, we'll go ahead with the HTF first. And then, I'll say we go back to the status quo. That means if there is any new development, the project will be discussed by the panel first before the item is submitted here for funding. I think this is really of our concern, whether the Legislative Council can monitor the funding for university hostels. Secretary, as Mr. Ip Kin Yuen just mentioned, is a rather special case because we have a number of projects already at hand which we believe should be undertaken. In the past, the practice is that the universities are responsible for the project, for the construction and the monitoring of works. We therefore believe we should take this special approach to address these projects. Whereas in the future, at the moment, we don't see any other hostel development projects. Of course, it depends on the actual circumstances. But if there are future hostel development projects, I don't think the same approach will be taken because projects will be floated individually. There won't be any backlog of cases or projects for our approval. So by then, I reckon we'll be able to submit the projects to LegCo one by one. That will be the principle we adopt in the future, but of course it also depends on the actual circumstances. So this is a special arrangement, Chairman, because all the projects are ready to be implemented. In the past, they should have been implemented one by one. We haven't done that, and that is why we have this one-off exercise. But if one-off grant is provided, we won't be able to scrutinize every project. And it seems that the electrical's power is undermined. We have discussed with the administration whether after this funding application is approved, the design of the hostel and the construction progress can also be made known to the panel on education for our consideration, so that if necessary, we can have a discussion at the panel. Can you do that? If you can, I think to some extent we'll be able to retain the electrical's power of monitoring the works. Chairman, I think we should consider the different stages of a project. First is on project design. Second, on monitoring of works progress once construction commences. And as I mentioned, we're in the paper. We're going to submit a paper on an annual basis to the panel on education on the works progress. As far as the design is concerned, a paper can be submitted at the design stage to the panel on education, and if necessary, the project can be discussed. Mr. Eddie Ju. Oh, Mr. Ray Chen should go first. Thank you, Chairman. My understanding is that, according to the Secretary, the Hostel Development Fund is set up to deal with the shortfall of hostel places, and it is like paying off a debt. It is supposed to be a one-off exercise, but things are not certain. According to the Secretary, after making up the shortfall, we don't envisage any demand for other major hostel development project. Well, I don't think you should be so certain, because at the moment the policy is 1 year hostel life for students. But if you change that policy, definitely there will be greater demand, and you need to identify sites for hostels. Say you can change it to 2 years in hostels for 4-year program. Well, I was in a Chinese university, and I recalled a debate that for Hong Kong University, they do not give this guarantee that students would be given a hostel place. But when I was in Chinese university, I found the most meaningful time I spent in university was when I stayed in the hostel. So I really think that this policy should be maintained. However, I heard Mr. Leung Yiu-chung ask the Secretary yesterday, and in fact, Secretary cannot guarantee after making up the shortfall of hostel places, you can ensure that a place will be provided. I understand the priority is given to students who live far from the university. But that means, of course, non-local students would be given priority since their home is not even in Hong Kong. So would it lead to a smaller chance or a smaller percentage of local students being able to live in a hostel? Because if the policy is 1 year hostel life for a 4-year program, and after all, this is education policy, we hope that through providing students with a hostel place, we can help enrich their life in the university campus and facilitate exchange. But of course, the Finance Committee would, of course, agree that they should be lumped together so that we don't need to have separate items dealt with at the Finance Committee.
So you have reviewed the whole exercise, and compared to one-by-one vetting, what are the risks or constraints? Have you looked at that? For example, we have a narrow room for discussion. I had only one opinion, and we shouldn't have a big discussion. If you want a quick arrangement where you can use containers, cargo containers, and that's what is being done in the Netherlands. So social housing is used cargo containers. We won't have room for discussion of this in the future, but what are the risks, the constraints, and could the Secretary respond for further discussion? Well, yesterday we had talked, our difference from this and on previous occasions is that on this occasion they have done a lot of preliminary design, and then the government will make some amendments or provide input, and there will be a final opinion before we go to LegCo and consult LegCo in the education panel and the public works subcommittee, and then seek approval in the FC. So our current practice is we've set aside some funds. They can continue with their design, preliminary work, but since they already have money in hand, they already have approval, they can start immediately. So some legal requirements such as design, yesterday Ms. Tanya Chen asked about some. We will give them some basic requirements that they need to satisfy, but for example, they have a lot of flexibility in design, as Mr. Chan said just now. For example, cargo, container cargo housing, they can consider that. But if they submit that proposal, the government will consider, do we want to consider such avant-garde approaches? They will have a lot of flexibility. I know there is autonomy and flexibility, but you can continue in the second round. Mr. Eddie Chu. Thank you, Chairman. I'm also from CU, but I didn't enjoy the best part of the experience, that is the hostel experience, and I was a victim of the 4-hour commute, and my college did not have the 1-year hostel experience, so regarding the 4-hour commute, that needs to be reviewed, and we now have under this consideration foreign students are guaranteed a space. It takes me an hour to go home, and I can't stay on campus for a very long time. If I could return home in 30 minutes, I could stay later. So in the future, I wonder if there are any venues to consider this 4-hour commute policy. It should be shortened. So that is one opinion. I feel this whole arrangement, the part that needs discussing is the government always pledges or acknowledges that its work is very slow. So when they tell the public, the establishment will say it's because of the pan-democrats, they're filibustering. But in paragraph 7, I'd like you to note there is a competition, and what is that competition? That is, there is an exercise within the government every year, and LegCo is not aware, and that is an area of dissatisfaction amongst the different parties. For example, in NT East, the Fanlang Center, it's been dragging on for some 10 plus 20 years, and only finally we achieved the funding. That is an internal administrative issue. But now they are bypassing that, and they're using two methods to deal with it. The first method is this, where they're asking us to approve one lump sum of money for them to spend, and it's similar with the innovation technology item. And second method is, I heard in the briefing, the container port terminal, there are 10 terminals that need to be improved, re-provisioned. But if you apply one by one, it will be filibustered. So we need to authorize them 150 million expenditure could be granted in a block allocation, and they can do it on an annual basis. So these two methods to circumvent LegCo, I feel this should be compared to the government's internal competitive process, where non-controversial items that receive all the parties' support, and also it's a livelihood issue. It's, for example, the hostels. But compared to the bridges and fancy projects, infrastructure projects, they will always lose to the big fancy projects. So perhaps officials from commerce and industry, finance and treasury, they can explain to us that why these non-controversial items they cannot rank higher. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chu had pointed out that there is an internal funding priority exercise. We still have that arrangement. You have to understand, a government, it has to deal with different requests, including social projects, so there has to be a priority. It's just that today we see that there has been an accumulated shortfall in the university hostels, and at the same time we have the financial resources to make a one-time arrangement to resolve this accumulated problem. So we have applied this internal prioritization, and today we feel that we can handle it in this manner. Okay, please continue the second round. Mr. Andrew Wan, in paragraph 4B, it says all research postgraduate students and non-local students should be granted student hostel places. So does that mean that non-local students studying in Hong Kong will definitely get a hostel and during their program, and you have 14,734 how many local students and how many overseas students need hostels? And in paragraph 4, you also talk about some standards. So who set these standards or criteria? When was it established? Will it be reviewed? I heard just now that if overseas students, the undergraduates, these students might increase. So will there be one day when local students, when their hostel places will be diminished? Will there be some proportion between local overseas students? Or in paragraph 4C, aside from the travel time, well, you should also consider the family circumstances. Will you also consider the circumstances of needy students? Allow me some time to explain paragraph 4. So how do we calculate the shortfall of hostel places, or how many hostel places each university should have? There are 3 criteria we apply. So we assume that each undergraduate will have 1 year hostel. So if there are 1,000 students, there should be 250 hostel places. And all non-local students are given a hostel space where we have a figure there. And according to past experience, how many students need a 4-hour commute time, we have some data. So using these 3 data sets, we can calculate the total number of hostel spaces. So at the university, how do they delegate these the space? Now the universities are independent and autonomous. They have their own practice. A lot of universities, when they have a shortfall, they will consider family background, their physical condition, and whether the student participates in school activities. That could be a consideration. So they have some criteria. So after we fulfill the numerical need, we have some further consideration. For example, C, we talk about local students. So there was a concern that overseas students, they will be excluded from the 4-hour criteria. This 4-hour criteria is for local students. They are given priority if they have to travel 4 hours. The second consideration for local undergraduate students, they have a 1 year and a 4-year program. And in B, we have reservations for research postgraduate students and non-local students. And there could be some other additional criteria, such as their physical condition, they cannot commute, then they might be given a space, a hostel space. So we allow the universities some flexibility and consideration. But we have a requirement of them in 4A and C. They will have a priority over item B. So I hope that can explain, that can resolve the concerns of our previous speakers. Chairman, I also asked, does that mean that non-local students will definitely get a hostel space? Is that the case? Well, when you do the calculations, yes, but in actual conditions, let's say 1 year let's say we have a fixed number of non-local students, and 1 year they have a recruited an exceeding amount, or maybe 1 year they have more local students. So, yeah, I understand. Let me follow up. So the Secretary said that is just a framework and there's some flexibility. But is there any regulatory regime over this allocation of hostel space? Well, the UGC doesn't look at it case by case. We have to respect their administrative autonomy and independence. So we see that they have a priority, and we feel that it's acceptable. Of course, if there are cases that require a separate handling, then we'll look at that. Well, I declare that I teach at City U. Just now, a few colleagues, especially the CU graduates, we had experienced hostels. I had experienced the hostel living and also participated in student activities. And some students with physical challenges also get a hostel space. That category has always existed, and I want to ask some follow-up questions. So regarding the hostel life, I think it's necessary. If you ask me, my own experience, I give it 3 A's. It helps in leadership and other aspects. But today I notice that the government perhaps we need to divert more resources to hostel life. I feel that 1 year of hostel experience in the 4-year program is not sufficient. It should be expanded. And one unhappy experience in the last few years, I've visited some hostel. There have been some suicide cases in hostels, and I noticed that young people now, compared to our generation, some young people, might be a generational gap. They like to live at home, or perhaps they're not mature enough to live in a hostel, or when you have a group of young people with negative emotional states, and they affect each other. And in the dorms, you have one person looking after the whole dorm. So the whole hostel framework should be enhanced. One warden is not sufficient. In the past, we might have barbecues, we might have activities that was very happy. So we have to look at the youngsters of today. We have to tailor make it for their benefit. And you mentioned that overseas students also get hostel space. Is it a 1-year minimum? Well, we send our kids overseas, and they cannot guarantee all overseas students will have a dorm space. But the school has a very good system. Let's say you've spent 1 year on campus. If they rent student dorms off campus, but it's not the schools, and the students have an extra choice, because they need to learn to be independent. The universities don't want the students to rely on their families too much. So you're saying you're paying off your debt, and in the future you could develop it. So is there a policy to assist students? They can be independent. Overseas, we can have arrangement with house owners where the whole house is rented out to students. So it helps them grow, and we also need to spend some resources on their emotional side. That's an opinion. Well, thank you, Ms. Leung. Whether they are living on campus or not, they have emotional needs. We are concerned about their emotional well-being. We've seen some unhappy incidents in the past, and we tell universities that they need to strengthen their counseling work, and we wish to continue, especially if there is a hostel, there is residents. It should help them. It should help them stand up on their own 2 feet. Dr. Fernando Jung, I'd like to ask a question about paragraph 6. It says there is a chronic shortfall of public funded student hostel places, and it limits the number of overseas students to benefit from hostel life. So local students also have exchanges overseas, and if we cannot provide sufficient hostel spaces for foreign exchange students, that leads to when we conduct exchanges, we also might be negatively affected. I think that's what it means. So I want to ask the Education Bureau or the UGC. You know that the hostel policy, so exchange students, they have a higher priority than local students. And just now the Education Secretary said the 15 projects of 10 billion will include the needs of all the universities' non-local students. So non-local students, have you divided how many do exchange students have a priority over other non-local students in allocating hostel space? Well, Chairman, in the paper, at the end of paragraph 4, we say that regarding exchange students, in our calculation, aside from paragraphs 4A, B, C, we have included 140 spaces. We have set aside more space for exchange students. And of course, we still have a shortfall. They might not be able to use all of it. But in actual fact, when we have the full number of spaces, how do the universities prioritize? We don't have a fixed policy. Should it be exchange students or local students? We let them to decide. But if members have a special view, we are happy to refer that to universities, and we need to respect the universities.
Understood, Chairman. I think, as a matter of principle, I think the university should give priority to local students. The hostel needs of local students should be taken care of, first of all. As for the needs of non-local students, if we have the ability, we should also cater to the needs. But for people of our generation, many of our children would study overseas in Western countries, and when they do, we all know that they will not be definitely given a dormitory, place. Likewise, students from other countries coming to Hong Kong. Should the government, take up this, obligation to provide them with a hostel place? I don't think so. When we have sufficient resources, when we have enough land, then there's no problem. But what you're saying in this paragraph is that given the shortfall of hostel places, it would affect the internationalization efforts of our universities. I would beg to disagree. If we have exchange programs with other countries, definitely there would also, if we have arrangements in respect of hostel places, I don't see how the universities should give priorities to exchange students when it comes to provision of hostel places. Well, according to my experience in local and foreign universities, now if you give priority to exchange students, then the constraints that you talk about in this paragraph will simply vanish. It's not possible that if we offer the hostel places to the non-local students, and as a result we will not be able to cater to the needs of exchange students, and our students will not be able to go on overseas exchange programs either. Now, for non-local students, we're not saying that we are, allocating our resources to the non-local students. We just want to facilitate exchange between non-local students and the local students. For non-local students, we're talking about exchange students who will come for half a semester or a year. So when they come for 3 months, it's easier for us to offer a place. But we cannot reserve all the hostel places, and these exchange students will only come for 3 months. So I think the university would need to strike a balance. Sao Lok Hin. Well, the criteria that the universities should travel to and from the campus daily for more than 4 hours will be given priority. I think this is simply not practical. When you estimate the number of hostel places, I think we should bear this in mind. That is in Hong Kong. If you go to any location in Hong Kong, would you be able to go there in 4 hours? I think you will be able to go to any place, most of the places within 4 hours. Now this year, we have 82,000 odd university students, and only 0.7% would satisfy the criteria in 4 bracket C, and 0.5% would be those studying at the UST because it's more remote. So only 0.2% of our university students would satisfy the criteria, namely that they need to spend more than 4 hours commuting. Why don't you admit that this criterion is not really realistic? I hope the Bureau, of course we admit that there is a shortfall of hostel places and you need to increase the provision, but your criteria should be that, well, actually when I was a university student, the university would not consider the time I spent commuting. They would consider the district where I live. Say, for example, if I were a CU student and I live on the South District or in Yuen Long, then one can imagine that priority will be given to those people who live in more distant, more remote districts. I think that would be a more realistic arrangement. We now have 80,000 university students, and you think that you should offer a certain percentage of these students hostel places. Well, that would sound more reasonable. So, Mr. Secretary, when you assess, the provision of hostel places, I think you need to be more down to earth, Chairman. I think there are two different concepts here. When we discuss how many percent of the students should be offered hostel places, bearing in mind that we should offer them at least 1 year of the hostel place for 1 year of the program. When we talk about 4 hours commuting time, we're talking about the time they take every day going to the campus, and not the possibility, the possibility of their being offered a hostel place. When they travel to campus and it takes 2 hours, well, I think we've actually conducted a study recently, and we think the 2 hours is more or less right, because we have very convenient, public transportation in Hong Kong. If it takes 2 hours per trip going to the campus, we believe that in that case a student should be offered a hostel place, because many people take more than an hour or so going to school or to work. So I don't think we need to reduce the duration further. Of course, members can have a different opinion, but as far as we're concerned, I think spending 2 hours, per trip going to and from the campus is a reasonable criterion. Based on the criteria that every student would be given hostel place 1 in every 4 years of the program. Well, Chairman, I don't know whether it's this time where we're going to build more hostel places, we'll be able to offer students at least a hostel place for 1 year in the program. But in my office, I have some interns who are about to be admitted to universities. After they read this paper, they really have very strong views, that is, amongst their peers. Some students live in Shuttlecock and they're attending the Hong Kong U, and they're not given a hostel place. Someone else live in Shau Kei Wan and attending the CU, again, he's not offered a hostel place. So in the paper, you mention the figure of 0.7%, and you say that you're able to address the issue. I really question that. I hope the Bureau can really, review your method of calculation. Mr. Cheung Kwan, I think the shortage of hostel places has always been an issue. This time the government is willing to, provide a one-off grant, and I support that. But I have some questions regarding the financial arrangement. In paragraph 19, you say that you are going to offer a one-off grant to the universities, and you say that in future, during the work period, there might be inflation, and that therefore, for the cash, which has not yet been committed to any projects, the university could, invest them. But if anything should happen, the government will not, be liable. But if the universities were to make investments, does it mean that the universities and the government are both confident that definitely they will be able to catch up with the rate of inflation, with their investment returns? But in future, if we're going to have a few more rounds of trade wars and the university end up losing money, how are we going to resolve that problem? Also, yesterday, the Secretary said that the government subsidy is 75%, the university will have to come up with 25%. And the Secretary said that the university wouldn't have any problem raising the remaining 25%. But has the university or the government considered this point? Because this time, according to your paper, you have 15 projects, 9 of which will complete it in the next 4 to 6 years. The expected completion date is 2022 to 2026. In other words, for the 6 universities, within 4 to 6 years, they will be asking for funding and they will try to raise 25% of the funds. So according to past experience, has it been possible for the universities to raise the required amount of funding within 4 to 6 years? Chairman, the whole arrangement that we are proposing now, that is, we give a one-off grant to the universities, and regarding how the universities will cope with the rate of inflation and escalating costs, we have had a thorough discussion with the universities, and they fully realize what would be the commitment in respect of this project, and they are confident that they will be able to cope. So that is a consensus between us. Over the years, the universities have gone through ups and downs in our economy, and they also have some reserves which they manage. So the universities all along have confidence. But of course I cannot say what problems will arise and how they will be resolved. But should there be very exceptional circumstances, the government will certainly talk to the universities as to how to resolve the problem. But as of now, we do not envisage any major issue. Regarding fundraising, the universities really have the ability to raise funds. In the past, we have had several rounds of matching grants. That is, the government, if the university could raise $1, then we will also give them a $1 subsidy. Last time, I think within 2 to 3 years, I think for the matching grant, normally we allow them 2 to 3 years. For the UGC institutions, it was no major issue for the universities to raise $2 to $3 billion. We are providing $10 billion of grants, and for the universities to raise 200 to 300 million in a few years shouldn't be an issue. We've already, furthermore, this is something that we've arrived at after talking to the universities, and we think that there shouldn't be any major difficulties. Chairman, I have one more question. Among all the projects for the City U, they have one hostel located in Mount Shan. Are these hostel places, given to students who study at Kowloon City? Well, the hostel at Mount Shan is a hostel for City U students. And if the students travel to Kowloon Tong by train, it shouldn't take a long time. Chairman, I'd like to first of all declare that I am on the Council of the CU. I think when you mention 4 hours, you're talking about 4 hours round trip. If the student takes 4 hours, goes traveling campus, then would be serious. So I think we need to clarify this point, Mr. Au Lok Hin. And secondly, we're now talking about the allocation of hostel places. How the universities allocate these places and what are the criteria, that is another subject. I think the allocation of hostel places by universities should be left to the universities. Mr. Wen Siu Kin asked whether not every student should be offered 1 year of hostel place in their program. That's not the case. But in different, colleges in Song Chi and New Asia, I don't think the students studying in these two colleges will not have an equal, opportunity or chances of getting hostel places. When the government fund the building of these hostel places, I think the government will have to explain further For those who've not stayed in hostel places, I think the secretary explained that to them. And secondly, we are now providing a grant for the universities to build these new hostels. For New Asia College, they've been talking about the building of a hostel for 10 years ago, and it's still a tennis court now. So if we adopt the usual FC approach, and we have to come to apply for funding for each of these 10 hostels, how long do you think the whole project will take? And if we don't rely to the fund, then how long and how much will it cost for these hostels to be built? Well, regarding hostel places, when the universities allocate these hostel places, they have their own system because the university has the autonomy to make that decision. But as for this particular program, we have the requirement, which is that for undergraduate students who travel to and from campus daily for more than 4 hours will be given the highest priority. And the second priority will be given to local students. That is, for every 4 years for the 4-year program, they will be offered at least a hostel place for a year. As to how they allocate the places, different universities may have different approaches. The universities may give higher priority to those people who are physically handicapped or ill, but when they, the university will come out with their own scoring system. As to how the places are allocated, that is within the autonomy of the universities. But if we do not adopt this method, if we follow the past procedure, I wouldn't be able to tell members how long it will take. Because every time, for every project, the advance work and the negotiation with the government as to how the hostel should be built and how it should be designed, it will vary from project to project. Every year, it will depend on how much resources we will get in a particular year. It's not like the resources required to build a bridge. Building a school and building a hostel place or a special school, I may give high priority to building a special school rather than hostel places. So I also need to work out my own priorities. So whether or not we will be able to get the funding will depend whether how many other projects the Education Bureau have the need to apply for funding. So we do not adopt this method. I can't tell you how long it will take. Well, in the last 10 years, how many hostel places that you've actually, approved funding? Well, 2012, we approved a project to build a new hostel at the CU. If you do not adopt this approach, in the past 5 years, you only built one hostel for postgraduate students and no local students have benefited. So I therefore hope that the members will support this program so that more undergraduates will benefit. In my time, we had a 3-year curriculum. Now we have a 4-year program. Obviously, we don't have a 3-year program now, but I think it's better that you could allow students at least 1 year of hostel place for every 3-year program. Well, Chairman, I think the circumstances for each different hostels are different. For example, the Hong Kong U are building modular units. For other institutions, they have other, constraints. When we approve each individual, project for hostels, and because we need to know the background of each project. But for different universities, after they've obtained funding to build the hostels, so when works are being carried out, are there any mechanism for you to monitor the project? If there should be issues with the quality of the works, or when problems are encountered in the course of construction, will you come back to the education panel to inform members and for follow-up?
Secretary, let me explain in greater detail under the existing mechanism, usually in terms of the design or at the stage of approving the application, there'll be a chance for us to understand the design and the details. After approving the funding application by the Finance Committee, the project will be passed over to the University Council, and then it will monitor the use of funding and works progress. If necessary, we'll report back to the Legislative Council, of course, especially when there is cost overrun. We may need to apply for funding with the FC. As for the monitoring of works, we seldom would report regular effort in this regard to the panel on education. Now, the university will be responsible for design, and we're not going to need to approve that design so that the universities will have flexibility in its hostel design. There is no need to go through every detail with the government. As long as a place is provided to the student, we don't mind if they're innovative. And in fact, the UGC will also monitor the works and will also require submission of reports. Secretary, I understand, but still it involves the approval of funding, because you provide subsidy for the amount ranging from 670,000 to 993,000 multiplied by the number of hostel places. For example, for the Hong Kong University, the site is near a slope, so the situation could be very different. I want to know whether the subsidy amount it has come by as a result of having considered the different factors I mentioned. Please press the button and wait again. Mr. Siu Ka-chun. I need to ask a question on benchmark. According to this paper, for a single room, it's 8 square meters per room. So that's the same proposal we made at the subcommittee. So thank you for supporting us. But I have a question on the benchmark. First, on the unit cost, $10.3 billion for 13,400 places. So what's the cost, and how do you compare this with the unit cost for PRH units? Second question: if if the construction period lasts for more than 4 years, there will be a penalty. So why 4 years, not 3 years? Why not 5 years? And about 75% subsidy cap, you mentioned that it is in established practice. So again, is the 4-year construction time limit an established practice as well? I will refer members to enclosure 2. We have set out all the 15 projects, and we have also included the unit subsidy. Unit subsidy and the cost. So $673,000 unit subsidy rate would be applied to the projects except 3 because of the site constraints. For example, the site may be situated on a slope and a high cost may be needed. And otherwise, $673,000 should suffice. and the amount is set based on the latest project of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. With adjustments made during the construction process. For the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, there was a student hostel built on a slope, and we also drew reference from the project to come up with the $993,000 unit subsidy rate. So we're not conjuring these figures out of thin air. We do have a basis in quoting these figures. We mentioned $1.12 billion, but after the calculations are complete, we have adjusted the amount to $10.3 billion. We want to make sure that public money is spent properly. I understand that, under Secretary, but Secretary, but I want to be able to compare that with a PRH unit. We don't want luxury hostel places. Do you have any figures for comparison? Chairman, we're not comparing hostel places with PRH units because these are two very different things. We have communal facilities like laundry room and communal kitchen, so the design is very different from a PRH unit. But we did look at the youth hostel projects. The unit cost is about 800,000 to 1 million. So I would say that these figures are close. But of course there would be adjustments due to different projects. Mr. Ip Kin Yuen, I need to declare that I'm also a council member of the Hong Kong University. Just now Mr. Ray Chan compared the hostels in CU Hong Kong and Hong Kong UN. I need to respond to that. Mr. Ray Chan seems to say that the Hong Kong University doesn't attach importance to the to hostel life, but I don't agree. On the contrary, the Hong Kong University has a very colorful campus life. And Mr. Ray Chan, if you're interested, you can watch a local movie that depicts the life of students in Hong Kong University. I think students all agree that hostel life is very important. And according to the paper, under prevailing hostel policy, it is said that student hostel life is an essential part of higher education. Once this is established, then we can then move on to read paragraph 4, which states that there are three circumstances, three scenarios in calculating the number of student hostel places needed. First, 1 year in hostel for a 4-year program, 2 non-local students, research students, and 3 undergraduate students with long traveling hours. And then all undergraduate students should be given the opportunity of staying in student hostels for at least 1 year of their program. But this is just bare minimum. Other members already mentioned that when they were in university, they only managed to stay in hostel for 1 year, and if that is the case, there is no sustainability. Some students should be able to stay for at least more than a year during their program in hostels, or perhaps throughout all 4 years of their programs. So under the current policy, it seems that there is no guarantee that local undergraduate students will be able to stay in student hostels for a longer period of time. For point B, there may be a bigger impact because among research postgraduate students, the proportion of non-locals is on the rise. And that means for local students, the chance of getting a hostel place may be affected. So I want to know, first of all, whether you have the percentage for non-local and local students getting hostel places. And second point, I think both the administration and the Legislative Council are responsible for ensuring that student hostel life is an essential part of higher education. And this also applies to local students. In other words, you should have a percentage in mind. And I'm going to suggest to the education panel that we discuss it in the future. So figures, can you give a response? Secretary. Chairman, since we're not able to provide the adequate hostel places as needed at the moment, in terms of allocation of hostel places, we may not be able to follow the priorities as mentioned, that locals would be given priority. In 2017-18, for local students, staying in hostels 19,400 plus, and for non-local students 16,217. Well, members, this item seeks to provide hostel places, funding for hostel places, and I don't see major objection, and we have discussed it for over an hour. All right, there is objection, I'll let you explain. All right, silence. Order. Mr. Adiju, if you want to be rowdy, you need to let me finish what I say first. I invite members to come down because we're going to vote on the item very soon. Dr. Fernando Zhang, 4 minutes. Well, last round I asked a question to confirm one thing. We're short of hostel places in universities, but it should not be it should not be the excuse for saying that we are not promoting internationalization in the higher education sector, because we can have students sent abroad for exchange, and we can have exchange students from overseas, and all these would not be subject to the lack of hostel places. And you mentioned local students 16,000 plus, and local students in hostels 19,000 plus. Comparing to the total number of students, what's the mix between local students and non-local students? You mentioned the number of local and non-local students staying in hostels. What about the student number in total? Switch on Secretary's mic, please. Internationalization. I won't say that internationalization can't take place because of insufficient places, but indeed there are constraints. For example, and if we exchange an equal number of students with another university abroad, and if we're not able to provide the same number of hostel places, then some universities may turn us down. But I do agree that it is not, strictly speaking, a constraint. And I will ask my colleague to see if we have the figures ready. And if we have the figures, we can give the figures to members. But you don't have it at the moment. For local students going abroad, their hostel places may be vacated if they are staying at the hostel at the moment. For exchange students coming over, they may stay with a host family instead of taking up a hostel place in a university. So I think it's just an administrative issue. Please don't blame it on insufficient hostel places. As for non-locals, we're mainly talking about mainland students, not international students. In fact, especially for research postgraduate students, it's mainlandization, not internationalization. Because if you just look at the figures, over 80% of these research students are from the mainland. Our resources are valuable. Why is it that it is not allocated to promoting internationalization? And about 4 hours of traveling, the policy was set in 1996. It hasn't been changed for many years. And then you say that we cannot guarantee when international students come, they'll be given a hostel place. This is ridiculous. As far as education is concerned, we have matchbox-style school premises, and we also have special schools that are matchboxes. I'm not saying that we should not give or improve the condition of university hostels, but first of all, you need to get the priorities right. Because this is relatively luxurious, you need to make sure the priority is right. Mr. Ted Hui. When calculating the shortfall of 13,400, you have a very clear policy that the 3 criteria should be met. That is 1 year in hostel through the 4-year program, non-local student, and 4 hours traveling. These are how you calculate the number of places needed, but you need to be flexible. For the new hostel places, how will they be actually allocated? Does it meet our objective? Setting aside the shortfall, why is it that we still have some local students who have never been staying in a hostel for a year? And that's because of the fees. It's expensive. So have you considered why local students refuse to stay in a hostel even if they live very far away? Not all of them are poor students. So that also relates to how you monitor the operation in universities. So can you give us some figures? The average charges and the range of charges by these universities. Secretary. Regarding university hostels, no regular or recurrent funding is provided to universities for their operation. They need to be self-sufficient. In other words, they need to recover the operational cost. The charges range from 5,000 to 10,000 per semester, depending on the room type. And for example, for research student hostels, the charge may be higher. But sometimes bursaries are provided, and there is also a scheme to help poor students. If necessary, during the stay in a hostel, subsidy will be provided under the Community Care Fund. Of course, we need to consider whether to regularize the scheme. But regarding financial assistance, apart from the CCF, we also have student grants and loan. And under the SFAA, we also have student grant, which is non-means tested. But of course, we can have a more in-depth discussion on this policy issue, but I don't think it affects this funding application because the policy is that for university hostels, it should be self-sufficient.
策利用
So when you use public money to provide hostels, you have to consider local students not choosing the hostel because of price. It's not just a matter of affordability, it's a matter of whether they want to pay. So that would indirectly lead to, if local students don't want to choose, then more mainland or foreign students want to live in it. So, given this principle, document says that there is some regulatory regime. You will monitor them. So, could you install more requirements so that local students have a priority and don't feel that it's expensive and not choose to live there? My observation is a lot of hostel students, especially universities in the downtown area, they would rather share some subdivided units, and it's even closer to the campus. So that is something that Education Bureau needs to look at. You shouldn't just be allocating the funds and wash your hands of the matter. Mr. Alvin Young, I'd like to ask the Secretary regarding the penalty mechanism, and in Enclosure 3, you have mentioned that in some detail, but I want to understand. Enclosure 3 doesn't say if there are any disputes, if there are disputes between Education Bureau. Will it be settled in the courts? Will there be mediation, arbitration? Well, why do I mention that? It's because according to the paper, if there are delays, then universities will ask, the government will impose a penalty based on calculation. Is there any room for the disputes to be settled legally? Well, in paragraph 4 we say we need strong proof that there are some circumstances that are unavoidable. So there might be situations where that it would have to be decided by the courts, but through our work with the UGC, a lot of problems can be settled through a mutually acceptable manner. So, will the government sign any documents with the universities, such as contracts, that would allow both to avoid the courts? Because if there are disputes, some of the university's money comes from public funds. I don't think that it's meaningful to use public funds to spend it in the courts. So you should allow mediation or arbitration that would save legal costs. I'm not sure, are there any documents outlining such an approach? Chairman, the UGC will sign an agreement with the universities, and it will deal with the sums of money, penalties, the allocation of hostel space, and so on. We will make requirements. So we are still drafting the documents. So if there are disputes, what kind of mechanism will be deployed to resolve disputes? So we will include these in the documents. I also suggest that mediation be used. It would be cheaper. Ms. Tanya Chan, I have to thank Education Bureau for providing an enclosure where they discussed the standards of the 300 hostel spaces. It includes GFA and so on. But first of all, I want to ask, the document talked about the standards. This was drafted in 2000-2001. The PWSCI also says so. So I want to understand, has this been reviewed over the years? And Chairman, you also see that the table lists 300 hostel spaces, but if we refer to enclosure 2 of the paper, we see there are 300 hostel spaces, but some hostel spaces amount to 2,000, and the majority of the hostel spaces exceed 300. So I want to understand, yes, of course, we are trying to catch up with a shortfall of more than 10,000. So is it increased in proportion, or so how we are increasing substantially the number of hostels? So I want to understand what factors did you refer to in the preparation process? Well, first of all, this is a reference for universities. For example, they will build according to a certain area standards, and of course the universities can change the design. In 2012, the Chinese U built a hostel. In principle, it was along this design, and the future hostels will also be using this design, but if you want to change the proportion, for example, the common areas, we can increase that. So if you look at, if you have a bigger hostel, it might have more stories, and each floor might have a common area. So it is roughly designed in proportion. So if we might have some narrow buildings or wider buildings, the usage might be different. But we hope that universities will more or less comply with this requirement. So you can say that this is your base, your minimum requirement. Yes, that is a standard, and some hostels, so even the 2,000 spaces, they might be a few buildings, a few hundred spaces in each building. For example, in the City University in Whitehead, they have 2,100 spaces. Baptist University has 1,700 hostel places. So I also want to understand, I want to ask a question about the regulatory regime. Well, yesterday I asked the universities need to submit a quarterly report to the UGC Secretariat. So what kind of information do they have to submit? Is it engineering or finance information? Yes, let me defer to UGC Secretariat. Thank you, Chairman. We require the universities to provide a quarterly report. It is related to the construction, the detailed design, tender, when they build the foundations, and when they apply for fire permits. That has to be provided in the quarterly report. Regarding financial reporting, we require a spending report every quarter, and we also require a donation report. Mr. Wu Jiwai, I note that calculating hostel spaces, you have a criteria in paragraphs 4 ABC. Now, each university, for each UGC funded university, the courses are funded by UGC. So in the calculation, it seems that all the undergraduates programs are calculated on the UG's funding basis. So in other words, if the university has self-funded courses, it's not included. So at the research program, whether it's self-funded or funded, that is included. So I want to confirm, is that the case? Chairman, we only calculate the funded places. So even for the research students and non-local students, they have to enroll in a funded program to be considered for hostel places. Yes. So this if they are self-funded students, will they get a hostel place? Do you have that information, Chairman? As far as I know, at the research level, they are all funded programs. So I am not sure what you mean. They are taking a research program, but it's not a funded program. MA does not belong in that class. The self-funded, let's say, the master programs are not included. So put simply, the self-funded programs are not included. I know self-funded programs are not included, but the question is, what mechanism and what information do you possess? Do you know the students in the hostels, are they in self-funded programs or funded programs? Who tells you that? Let me defer to UGC. The actual situation when we calculate the hostel places, I know how you, every year we ask the universities to provide the allocation information. So what type of students are, so in the information you cannot see, so you do not see, do you see self-funded students in their hostel? No, we don't see that, but some hostels are built by the universities themselves, so the university might allocate some hostels. So we have a 1-year residence in a 4-year undergrad program, and for the research programs, is it for the whole program or for the whole program? Because after this funding, we have some, if I understand correct, is it 40,000 plus hostel places? Yes. So if they have a 1-year residence in a 4-year, so if we're talking about so it has 10,000 places and 30 places, it might be for exchange students, research programs, and so on. I think it seems that if you're talking about the proportional ratio, you have not catered to local students. Will you adjust that? And even if you take this step, even if you build hostel places, you can adjust the proportion. Can you do that? That is the student combination who are given a hostel place. Well, as I said, the university, they have their own policies. Of course, we can discuss whether we need to adjust that at the policy level, but when we make adjustment, all the calculations, we might need to build more hostel places, but we are willing to discuss with the legislators the items in 4ABC, whether that needs to be adjusted. And of course, it's not directly related to today's agenda item. So can you tell us in criteria 4ABC what kind of students are enrolled according to the criteria? Chairman, we use these 3 criteria to calculate the shortfall, but when we build a bill, unless we say it's for the research program, it's hard to say who belongs where. Let's say I build 100 places and how many are criteria A, B, C. We don't calculate that. We calculate the shortfall. Let's say we build a research hostel for B, a building for undergraduates, but we don't calculate how many will come under C. So, well, you were given 4 minutes, but then you spoke 6 minutes. So I think I'll have to exercise strict control. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 time control is for question and answer. Otherwise, everybody overruns. It's not fair to people in the queue. Mr. Tan Jixun. The chairman, just now, I asked the question and the secretary has not answered. I asked him to explain the policy process. What have you sacrificed? What were your constraints? But I also need to respond to Mr. Yip Kin-yun. When you talk about CU, Hong Kong U, they seem to have clear differences. I'm saying that when CU has a better policy, it's because we started earlier with the requirement of having 1 year hostel in a 4-year undergraduate program. Of course, I'm aware of the movie, but there are very few of them. Of course, it would be nice to have 3-year residence. I would like 4-year residence in a 4-year program. The thing is, they cannot accommodate that. So we want more people to enjoy the residence program, or do we? Sometimes you might even learn more in the residence than in the classroom. So the question I had just now was, what have we sacrificed, and what risks or constraints do we have? But I had an even more fundamental question. So there's always been a shortfall of hostels. So when did we come up with this solution, the big solution? And chairman is asking us to speed up the process, but when did we come up with a big solution? And I look at February 2018, the 6 UGC-funded universities, they submitted the hostel development plan, and then you confirmed, then you came up with your big solution. Was that the case? Well, the whole development was when this term of government took office, under the leadership of the CE, we came up with a solution to deal with our inherited shortfalls. That's why I say you're better than the ex-Secretary of Education, Eddie Ng. So last July, we started the work, and in December, regarding initial findings, we consulted UGC and we asked them to submit their plans, how much time they needed, and up till the time we submitted our paper, we discussed with the universities regarding which projects were complex construction projects and needed more money, had a higher unit cost, and we also discussed details with them, including penalties, for example, how we should calculate the penalty interest and our regulatory progress. It also involved discussions with legislators. We needed to hear from the stakeholders, so we tried to submit our plans, our application to today's FC in a short period of time. You still haven't answered the constraints. In a lot of past government project experience, the logical will submit some views, but if the universities have little experience, will they have a higher risk? Would they be retaining Leighton and Chinese construction companies that have a poor track record? So will the government provide input? Chairman, in the past, when the universities implemented after our approval and after FC's approval, how could they identify subcontractors? It was up to the university.
That has not changed under the present scheme. Eddie G, I think you've stolen 5 seconds, 10 seconds from my, time. Thank you. I think these are really very, cunning projects. Of course, we're all in support of building more hostels. We're all in support of that. But you're very cunning in the sense that the funding application is a financial arrangement. So I think we should be discussing the financial arrangement and whether this council agrees with this arrangement. And there are 2 points, there are 2 areas where I don't agree with this financial arrangement. I urge members to veto this project. First of all, you are, authorizing the government to approve, an amount the maximum of which will be 1.6 billion. If you look at this project, it ranges from $160 million and so on. If you give them this full sum, you will not have the opportunity to vet all these 15 projects. The most expensive of which cost $1.6 billion, $1.67 billion. Now, I think there is a block allocation, but subject to a ceiling. Anything below $30 million, you can inject funds into the account of the universities. But here we're talking about a project costing $1.6 billion. And so I don't think we should simply give them that authorization in disguise. And secondly, the financial arrangement between the government and the universities are very strange. In paragraph 19, you say that you are now approving $10.3 billion, and you're talking about the price as at 2018, the price level as at 2018. But the hostels will only be completed in 2027. So in other words, the government is giving the universities, a lump sum at 2018 price level. But the government will not be responsible for subsequent price adjustments. So there will definitely be a gap eventually, and there will be a shortfall. And you can say that you can ask the university to invest the grants that they've been given. But should the investments fail, then you say that the universities will have to be responsible for their own investment decisions. The government will have no liability at all. So if the senior management of the universities make an investment decision and in the end the university suffered a loss, so would there be any penalties? Eventually you can only penalize the students. So regarding the first point, colleagues are saying that let's approve the funding approval even if the project costs $1.6 billion. But if we agree that these 15 projects should be, allowed to go ahead, I don't think we should give the universities that authority to make the investments of the grants. Because the government should actually be responsible, meaning that, first of all, you must guarantee that the funding will guarantee that the projects will be completed in month, and if should there be any cost overrun, I think we should have a responsibility. Otherwise, you're forcing the university to make investments, and these are the 2 bases on which I disagree with the project. Well, Mr. James Toh, 5 minutes. Chairman, I have a similar question. I think Mr. G's first point was that I think in the past we already had many university hostels, and you would pay the university the amount based on the cost estimate. You will not give them a certain amount and then you say depending on whether you're lucky or not with your investment, if you're not lucky then you have to really make up for the shortfall yourselves. That's not really the way it's done in the past. Could you explain whether this was the practice in the past? Well, this is a new arrangement. It's different from the previous arrangement. And I think we've said this many times in this council already. We're adopting a new approach to resolve the chronic shortfall of hostel places, especially when the land is already available. So is it the case, like Mr. G said, that if the universities don't manage the investment well, they will have to suffer the consequence, and they will somehow have to come up with the funds to build those hostels? Is it in the memorandum that the universities eventually have to, come up with the means to finish these projects? I think we both agree with the universities that after we've allocated this grant to the universities, they believe that within this specified period of time, they will be able to deliver the agreed number of hostel places. Now, for example, there are 7 or 8 universities here. Should we allow them to meet with us to explain why are they confident that they can deliver? Otherwise, different universities may have different amounts of reserves. They have different abilities in fundraising. What happens if they cannot come up with the required amount of funding? Let's say they've given you this undertaking, and if they fail to raise the required amount, then they have to cut corners elsewhere. Or if they cannot, finish the project, what's going to happen? You will be forcing university to spend a large amount to the tune of tens of billions to make investments. Of course, they would also invest their own reserves, but you're forcing them to increase the amount of the investments just in order that they can deliver. So I don't quite understand. For example, let's forget about the fact that you are taking away our ability to monitor these projects. What I'd like to know is that why can't we pay them the amount by installment? Why should we just pay them a one-off grant and ask them to take care of the rest? We're not giving them any less amount. We will give them the full amount of the grant, and then they can make appropriate investments. As Mr. Toh said, the universities would also make their own investments with the funds that they manage. You're giving them the amount based on money of the day prices. Are you saying that it should be enough, and last them until the time when the project is completed? We've already agreed with the university. Yes, of course, I know that. Otherwise, you wouldn't put this proposal to us. But what I'd like to know is why won't you pay them by installment? So instead, you can pay them whatever amount, you can reimburse them whatever amount they have spent in stages. If we were to pay them by installment, it's like, well, we have to know in detail how much money they need in different stages of the project, so that the universities will not have that much flexibility in the design and so on. So it's like the previous approach. We would need to know what are the details in respect of every different stages of the project, and then we'll aggregate the total amount required. If that's the case, then I think what you say in paragraph 8 will not work. You're saying that it will not weaken the government's, compromise the government's monitoring role. Mr. Lok Hin, I'd like to clarify again that Mr. Ho Kai Ming doesn't need to worry. We've been deliberating about 4 hours, and that's the round trip of commuting to and from campus. And I don't think that is realistic, because we all know that 2 hours refers to the trip to or from campus. For this session, I have 2 questions. First of all, I'd like to follow up on Mr. G and Mr. Toh's question. We're now setting up this fund because we want the universities to actually, foot the rest of the bill. after the universities have raised their own funding, will you give the universities the room to work with other institutions like the Jockey Club? Let's say they raise funds, the university raised their own funding, and they've obtained some funding from the Jockey Club, and they build a hostel and call it a Jockey Club, hostel. Would that be allowed? Yes, under the current system, this is allowed. If the government, pays for 75% and they pays for 25%, and after they've raised funding from a certain organization and agreed to give it the naming right, that would be allowed. I think what we're worried about is that after we've granted this fund to the universities, they will need to satisfy all these requirements. But they may think that after they have obtained, donation from certain organizations, and eventually when they build a hostel, of course they can now with additional funding can build more hostel places. That's a good thing. But we're worried that eventually lecturer will not be able to monitor what the final product will be like. I mean, they could be very extravagant with the provision. Secondly, I'm also more concerned about the question of timing, which my colleagues in my ward office are also concerned about how many students will benefit from these hostel places, because there is indeed an acute shortage. I'm not so fortunate like Mr. Kai Ming, where he was allowed to stay in a hostel for 3 years. In my time, we could only, get a place in a hostel if we, become a member of a student association. Next, I'd like to talk about the hostel fees. For the CU, it was up 9%, 2017-2018, and I'd like to ask the Bureau whether you're concerned about the increase in hostel fees in recent years. Is it that after the hostels are being built with the provision of a grant, does it mean that the university have to pay for the maintenance of the hostels? Yes. So I think in 2006, the UGC would pay for the maintenance of the hostels. As far as I know, the hostels always work on a financially autonomous basis. The government will not provide for any subsidies. I understand that you will only subsidize the building of the hostels. Even the UGC doesn't provide for funding for the maintenance. Yes. I don't know whether the Bureau could tell us why the hostel fees have been increased so much. Originally, I thought that this was due to the need for maintenance, or that the funding arrangement will give the incentive for the universities to raise hostel fees. Regarding the hostel fees, they are actually decided by the universities based on their own cost. So the government has not been involved in the setting of the hostel fees. Mr. Gary Fan, you're so fortunate to be able to live in student hostels. When you were students, I myself had not been so fortunate. Next to the place where I live now is the student hostel jointly used by students of the CityU and the Poly-U University. I think the Polytechnic University and the CityU are jointly building a hostel in Kowloon Tong. I'd like to ask whether this is a joint hostel for the two universities, like the hostel across where I live. You said, and also, have you agreed with the universities regarding the building of these joint hostels? When you answered Mr. Tanya Chen's question regarding the facilities of these hostels, the common areas, and so on. Now, if this is going to be a joint hostel, would that be a more cost-effective, solution? Would it give you the economy of scale? in that case, what will be the arrangement for the future maintenance for these joint hostels? Will there be a different arrangement? For the hostel in Tak Hong Road in Kowloon Tong, it is our plan to divide the site into two parts. City U and Poly U will each build their own respective hostels. It's not a single hostel jointly used by students of both institutions, although it's on the same site, but there will be two separate, blocks. I don't know I've answered fully your question, but simply put, you can say it's one site, but there are two separate blocks. So the common areas and facilities, they are independent of each other, yes, in principle. Of course, there are quite a large number of hostel units, 1,680 respectively. We are not intended to provide, more than 2,000 units in a single hostel or block. So building two separate blocks would be more reasonable. Mr. Lam Cheuk Ting, Chairman. According to the paper, we want to give more flexibility to the universities when they build these hostels so that they can actually, follow the internationalization program and allow more overseas students to attend these institutions. I think the Secretary would know that the audit report last year conducted a hearing on this subject. We can see that for non-local students, the numbers at the time showed that they made up 16%. Among the 16%, 7.6%, 76% will make up of students from the mainland. For non-mainland, non-local students who don't come from the mainland, they only made up 3.9%. So in the audit report, we also made the criticism that you're not really talking about internationalization, but mainlandization of the universities. You say you want to give more flexibility for the universities to raise funding to build more hostel places. But now we are getting the problem of mainlandization is becoming more and more serious. How can you really attract more overseas students coming to study in Hong Kong? What measures will you take to do that, Chairman? As to how we can make our universities more international, I think that has always been our objective. We've been exploring different means to attract more students from other countries to come to study in Hong Kong. Is a good thing. And that's why you can see that we're offering scholarships to attract students from other countries in Asia, such as Indonesia. We have the Belt and Road Scholarship, with which we would attract more students from those countries. We will make more efforts in that area going forward. But as to how many hostel places are offered to non-local students, that is not really relevant. Of course, we shouldn't say that we should not give more places to the mainland students, because as far as Hong Kong is concerned, they are non-local students. You may say that there are too many mainland students and we're not getting enough, other overseas students. We have no objection to that. We believe that it would be healthy, influence if we have more students from overseas. When I was attending CU, it was a little difficult to get a place in a hostel, because at the time there were many international exchange students from Japan, Canada, the States, and Europe. There were also some from the mainland, but the proportion was not like what they are nowadays. Nowadays in Hong Kong, many local students are not offered a place in a hostel. According to your criterion, only students who need to, spend 4 hours commuting will be offered a place in a hostel. If that, according based on this criteria, I think the student would need to live on Lantau before they will be offered a hostel place. If you need to go from anywhere to see you wouldn't need 2 hours. So this policy, objective is simply ridiculous.
And talking about giving more flexibility to the management of universities to get a hands on the matter, I'm sorry to say that I have no confidence in them at all, because we have lecturers who have worked in universities for over 20 years with very good performance, and they just drastically cut the pay and change the position from permanent to a temporary post or a contract post, saying that it is still legitimate. Come on. I'm talking about the senior management of some universities. They are building this kind of culture, and I'm concerned if we approve funding for them to go ahead with this, then how are we going to monitor their operation? It is about social justice, and this is what's happening in universities now. They have independent kingdoms. The meeting will be suspended for 5 minutes.